All right, I'm trying to get through these as quick as possible, so let's do this. Touchy, third physics. So this one will be, unfortunately, what I just said is probably going to be not borne out here because being a 3F type myself, I'm probably going to have a lot to comment on this one. Um, so maybe just give me a moment. Sorry to all the listeners here for my lack of professionalism, but I'm stripping off my hoodie to make this a little more comfortable because I have to turn off the AC in order to do these recordings because my mic is pretty crappy and the AC is too loud, so it's getting kind of hot in here. So just a little bit of 3F for you to start off. Touchy, third physics. Usually the third physics is born thin, thin-boned, and dies the same. Those stages of life that leave a noticeable mark on the physicist standing above have little effect on the appearance of the, he says touchable, but he means like the sensitive person, touchy. Even puberty, which usually quickly and noticeably changes a child's appearance in third physics, firstly begins late, and secondly proceeds sluggishly and dimly, although in the end all its signs are evident. The average touchy touch is a pale, thin, stooped person with long limbs and a neck, asthenic according to Kretschmer. The skin is poorly pigmented, and in general the skin is not good, because due to increased sensitivity, it reacts too violently with rashes, pimples, boils, blisters, etc., to environmental influences. The third physics physique is proportional and can often qualify for the highest marks. However, here's the strange thing. Facial features often lack proportionality. Severe facial asymmetry is common. Especially often the nose fails. It turns out to be either too wide or too long. The noses of Tolstoy and Paganini are not the limit in this regard. The conviction that one's appearance is unattractive, not always unfounded, with public demonstrations of complete indifference to the problem. In fact, for the touchy, it is of decisive importance, being its fix idea a stumbling block. So, what he's saying there is that 3Fs have a conviction that their appearance is unattractive, which sometimes is true, and publicly they try to be indifferent to the problem, but in fact it's actually a fixation of theirs. For myself, unfortunately, it is very true and a serious hurdle for me to deal with. But continuing on, Tolstoy, who provides the richest material for describing the third physics, formulated the state of his as follows. I was shy by nature, but my modesty was further increased by the conviction of my ugliness, and I am convinced that nothing has such a striking influence on a person's direction as his appearance, and not so much his appearance as the conviction of his attractiveness or unattractiveness. The plasticity of the touchy is dynamic, and in this he is similar to the hard worker. However, there are also significant differences. The movements of third physics do not have the same confidence, accuracy, and purity. The touch-me-not, plastic, is characterized by a certain vanity, excessive energy, intensity, and careful movements. Oh, yeah, for real. Like the second physics, the third physics is restless, perhaps even too restless. Therefore, it can sometimes be funny and instructive to watch the crowds at bus stops. If you have to wait long enough for the bus, the crowd itself imperceptibly stratifies into two parts, static and dynamic. The picture turns out like this. The productive physicists, first and fourth, stand motionless, so they're statics, without changing their pose for a long time. And the processional physicists, second and third, wander around these statues in a Brownian-like restlessness. Moreover, among the latter, meaning the third physics, thin, stooped, big-nosed people show particular restlessness, third physics. And I mean, yeah, it does ring true to me. And personally, while I have built some muscle through going to the gym, um, I am thin boned and somewhat stooped, and I have a big nose. So it is quite true, and my skin does tend towards moles and like pigmentation issues. And I have a friend who is also through physics, and I know he has a lot of skin blotches and moles and issues with like rashes and easily irritated skin. So it does seem true. Despite the fact that the touch me not, I like that, the touch me not, and the touchy touch. The touch me not looks rather sickly. Its body is not as fragile as it seems. The joints and cardiovascular system are kept in order until old age, which is facilitated by thinness, mobility, and moderation in food. The situation is somewhat worse with the respiratory and gastrointestinal systems. They cause third physics a lot of trouble throughout life and often lead to death. Well, shit. And it's funny because, like, as a 3F hypochondriac, of course, you naturally worry about, your heart and, heart rhythm and all that stuff, blood pressure. But, of course, that's not what's going to kill you. It's going to be your, lungs and guts that are going to lead to your demise. So be on the lookout. Although usually the touchy one demonstrates feigned indifference to his physical condition, it has enormous, incomparable power over him. Tolstoy admitted, "If I have an unhealthy stomach, then when I walk, I come across dog excrement everywhere on the road, so that it even interferes with my walk. But if, on the contrary, I am healthy, then I see clouds, forests, beautiful places." Isn't that true? A strange statement for a preacher of the theory of the superiority of spirit over flesh. Without admitting it to itself, third physics is very suspicious and listens with constant attention to the work of its own body. However, here one should not confuse the suspiciousness of the third physics with the suspiciousness of the first physics, which is episodic and gives preference to radical medical treatments. Suspiciousness of the third physics is a chronic processional phenomenon in which preference is given to prevention, hardening, and strengthening of the body. Very good little paragraph there. That rings quite true. I'm sure that the main inventors and consumers of yoga, raw food diet, winter swimming, therapeutic fasting, various types of gymnastics, etc., are precisely the touch-me-nots. You must have a distrust of your body, like that of the third physics, combined with the deepest care for it, in order, like yogis, to listen to its work for years, duplicate the unconscious control of the body with the conscious, find time and desire with the help of poses, diets, and breathing exercises to improve its functions. However, the suspiciousness of the third physics serves not only it, but often makes a great contribution to the improvement of society. Fear for oneself and the habit of listening to one's own body, due to the processivity of the third physics, usually turn on others and give the world irreconcilable fighters for the purity of nature, active promoters of a healthy lifestyle, and first-class doctors. Okay. If in childhood the third physics is accompanied by beatings, illnesses, hunger, then this often so refines it, initially refined, that the physical sensitivity of the touchy generally goes beyond the limits of the generally accessible and generally understandable. Simply put, a person becomes a psychic, initiated into the secrets of the body, the highest initiation for a person. Okay, that's kind of interesting. So I guess 3Fs should just be beaten and made sick and hungry early on, so they become psychics. I somehow feel people physically feel them, said Tolstoy. He spoke, hardly realizing the supersensitivity of Tolstoy's third physics was one of the two most important components of his genius. The ability for sensory empathy, even remotely, even just predicted, is the secret of Tolstoy's work. Reading in Anna Karenina the description of the scene when, after Karenin's visit, Anna feels the touch of his lips on her hand, like a burn, you understand, Not Anna, but Tolstoy himself, who had inhabited her shell, put his hand up for a kiss and with his hypersensitive skin felt the burning touch. The sensitivity of Tolstoy's third physics is not the limit. Sometimes the empathy of the touchy pants reaches such a degree that he not only keenly sympathizes with what the other is experiencing, but can directly experience the same thing. In science, this phenomenon is called stigma. Francis of Assisi, whose wounds opened on his hands and feet when contemplating the image of the crucified Christ, is the most famous example of a stigmatist. The compassion of the touchy pants towards people of manual labor is limitless. Sometimes it takes such exaggerated forms that it becomes downright anecdotal. For example, the following story was told about the famous French playwright Rostand. Rostand had his own coachman who drove only him. Rostand felt terribly sorry for him. When he had dinner after the theater, he could not think without shuddering that the coachman was freezing on the box, getting wet in the rain long after midnight. This thought poisoned all his pleasure. Therefore, he ordered to bring a glass of grog to the driver and tell him to go home. The owner, they say, will hire a cab. One night, the coachman burst into the cafe and announced to Monsieur that he was leaving, angry that he wasn't taken seriously. So, in other words, this guy, Rostand, felt very bad and empathetic towards his coachman, so he kept telling him to go home and, he'll bring a cab. And then the coachman, maybe, I don't know, fourth physics type or something, got mad because he felt like he wasn't being taken as a professional. So just it's kind of a funny story there. It's easy to guess the third physics. From infancy, she absolutely cannot stand tickling to the point of convulsions and carries hatred towards it throughout her life. According to this sign, the third physics receives the title touchy. The origin of such heightened sensitivity is in the initial feeling of hypervulnerability of the third physics, and through the prism of this hypervulnerability, all behavioral, legal, economic, aesthetic, and other aspects of the life of the touchable are clearly and easily read. And that's one of the interesting things about what he's doing here is he's bringing this past, like pure sensation, and he's bringing it into, the world of money and law and politics. So it's kind of neat. It's neat to see, like, for example, when he was talking in the last section about, 2F and kind of them, politically, it's like the 2F sort of politics is like, the social welfare state, as conceived of, in a certain guise, like by, I think he said like social democratic, but, not just like a lazy, welfare state, but one that like wants people working to enjoy work, and to, help the vulnerable when they need it. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting how he can analogize those things. Okay, losing my train of thought a little bit. All right, the vulnerability of the third physics is especially pronounced in the intimate sphere. Ooh, this one's gonna hurt. All of life seems to be a touchless path, blocked by a gigantic barrier, a bed, the safe crawling through which constitutes honey and the meaning of life. It may seem that I am exaggerating somewhat, but here are Tolstoy's own words, spoken with complete seriousness. Man experiences earthquakes, epidemics, the horrors of disease, and all sorts of torments of the soul. But for all times, the most painful tragedy for him was, is, and will be the tragedy of the bedroom. Here Tolstoy, completely groundlessly and for obvious reasons, turned his own problem into a universal one. Timidly and belatedly, in comparison with others, third physics begins his sex life. And almost no matter how it turns out, the usual dichotomy of the third functions in hard-to-touch sex also has the misfortune of being present. So it's a little weirdly written there, but the problems with the third function arise in sex just as much as they arise in any other sphere. Once a lady, an acquaintance of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, describing his third physics, said, well, that he was a platonic and immodest admirer. I would characterize the duality of the third physics more lapidly and harshly a hypersexual prude. Interesting. So there's basically this hypocrisy here between being very like lustful and wanting, but also being, prudish and kind of self-denying. No comment. On the other hand, the vulnerability of the third physics forces its owner to be hypocritical, to deny the meaning of eroticism, to portray it as something not worthy of attention, unclean. On the other hand, the same vulnerability of the third physics requires investing maximum strength and soul into sex in order to heal a constantly aching wound in this way. This is how the touchy person exists in two hypostases, causing bewilderment and criticism from her sexual partners. S.A. Tolstaya, looking at her husband, who at once became cheerful and kinder after the night spent together, venomously remarked, "If only those who read the Kreutzer Sonata with reverence would look for a minute into the love life that Lyovachka lives, and one of whom he is cheerful and kind, how they would overthrow their deity from the pedestal on which they placed him." The ulcer in the third physics can be so deep that their natural cessation of sexual activity is perceived as liberation from slavery. This is exactly what the playwright Euripides called his impotence, for which he was awarded the title of proto-Christian by Christian apologists. Using the example of Euripides, among other things, one more sign of a strongly wounded third physics is clearly visible: pathological hatred of beings of the opposite sex. So third physics are incels, I guess. None other than Euripides was the first to put forward in the drama Ion the proposal to reproduce in a same-sex way, by budding without women, and all subsequent touch-me-nots who theorized on this topic were only epigones of Euripides, and companions in misfortune. But yeah, yeah, sadly true. A timid suitor, a timid object. You know what? What it is, the opposite sex, but I guess for people who are homosexuals, I would assume it would actually be the same sex that they would feel this way about. But it's, being in others' negative position, it fears the influence of the other upon it. It's protective, but it's also unsure of its own abilities. So that creates that insecurity, that vulnerability and fear, and heightens it. And so, the opposite sex, or the sex that you are attracted to, it has power over you. I mean, especially for men, like women and their bodies has a lot of like physiological power over men. Like looking at a pretty girl, like physically, you have a physical reaction that's not under your conscious control, right? And so for 3Fs, that can be a painful experience, and it can give you a feeling of like powerlessness, and that can cause hatred, right? It can cause a sort of like chronic like loathing, not so much like hatred, like a violent hatred, but like a chronic loathing and like hypocritical self-hatred as well. So that's just to elaborate on that. A timid suitor, a timid object of courtship, a touchy one, prefers not to take initiative in love affairs. Here it is more convenient for him not so much to lead as to be followed. However, if the partner turns out to be assertive and delicate enough, and it comes to sin, he is pleasantly surprised and rewarded by the discovery of an inspired, voluptuous, and sophisticated lover in the touchy one. So in other words, if you give the 3F a chance, then they're actually, quite good lovers. So, ladies, pay attention. Firstly, the increased sensitivity of the sensory system turns the body of the third physics into one continuous erogenous zone. The back of the touchy one is especially erogenous. Since being the most defenseless part of the body, it is tuned to perceive the environment hyper-acutely. Secondly, for the same reason, third physics is sensitive to someone else's body, delicate, gentle, sensitive to the needs and capabilities of the partner. Finally, the specificity of the sexual psychology of the touchy pants requires putting other people's pleasure above your own. Moreover, it is in the visible manifestations of the experiences experienced by your partner that you see the sufficient and complete realization of your sexuality. So, if it is ever allowed to talk about sexual altruism, then this quality should be attributed first to the touch me not. And we can look back to his description of the the first physics, the 1F type. And, remember, they're supposed to be a capitalist, in the sense of private property, and they are, it's the first function, so it's selfish. And with the first physics, it's like in sex, they're either purely giving, they're purely taking, right? They're acting in a way just for their own pleasure, or they're purely giving. They're just purely they're taking control and just purely focusing on the partner, but they're still in they're still in a kind of a dominant position, right? Like they're the one acting, they're not being acted upon. But with the processional positions, second and third, they are collaborative and mutual. And so it makes sense that, in politics, the first step is selfish, private property, capitalism, whatever. And then the third physics would be altruistic and in sex as well. So, and he'll talk about the kind of politics and economics of the third physics in a bit. Take a sip of my tea. All this naughty talk is making me parched. Let's see here. Let me draw your attention once again. All the listed pleasures can be obtained from third physics only if maximum delicacy is observed. In sexology, for example, there is a known case where one man became impotent on his wedding night, and what brought him to this point was the completely innocent behavior of the bride. She, in the simplicity of her soul, simply lay down on her back and spread her legs. Such rudeness amazed the groom so much that he immediately lost his masculine power forever. Yeah, this is it's a very short example, and I don't know if other people, if maybe non-3F types, or I don't know, just people with a different sensibility on this matter. But yeah, it's kind of like the wife, maybe she was a 4F type or something, but just that passive behavior. I mean, I don't know, some guys might enjoy that, just being in a purely dominant position, having they say a starfish partner who just lays there like a starfish, and it's just yeah, just fuck me willy-nilly. But that kind of animalistic rutting without the sense of collaboration in sex, that's going to bother the process physics types particularly so, and particularly 3F, because it's it's just he says, there's a rudeness to it, but really there's a kind of an animalistic side of it that does not appeal to 3F. 3F wants mutuality in sex. However, predicting in advance where the sexuality of the third physics will stumble is a hopeless matter. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau fled from the arms of a young seductive Venetian woman, discovering that she had nipples of different shapes, and considering on this basis that she was some kind of monster, rejected by nature, people, and love. Damn, dude, that's harsh. Or here are some more excerpts from women's letters to a psychiatrist. I wasn't married, I didn't have any connections with men, I despise men. Men didn't offend me, didn't do any dirty tricks. It's just that when I was a child, about 12 years old, I was once walking down the street behind respectable men and heard them talking about married life, what it consisted of. Since then, I haven't been able to see them. And then, it happened in the 6th grade. Some fool of about 18 reached under my skirt. Then in the 8th, something like this happened again on the landing. If you look at it sensibly, there's nothing wrong with it. But from that moment on, fear took over me. I'm afraid to meet people. I'm afraid even of people I know. Don't get me wrong, I don't think all men are scoundrels, but it will remain. The third physics is the only one of the physics that is jealous with precisely physiological jealousy. For her, sexual intercourse is such a delicate, intimate, even sacred thing that the intrusion of strangers into this area is perceived as a desecration of a sacred place, after which physical rejection sets in. Carnal disgust and the likelihood of continuing the previous sexual life becomes, in any case, quite problematic. If over time the touchy one forgives betrayal, then he never forgets it. And yeah, I mean, I really don't want to divulge too much on this topic, but one thing I am thinking about this, like it's like a pretty cliche fantasy, especially for men, like to have a threesome, right? And specifically with like one guy and like two women. But honestly, even since I was a kid, I always disliked that. Like I've never had a threesome, and I dislike the idea. I don't think I would like it at all. And it's that it is jealousy, to be frank. Maybe it's a good sort of jealousy in that, just I don't know, trying to be less of a degenerate or something. But yeah, it is coming from like this jealousy and this dislike of the kind of like the rutting sort of sex, where it's like sex to just get off. It just seems wrong. There has to be something connecting, some mutuality to it to appeal to me. So I think that might be like 3F related. But anyway, I want to warn you, it is very difficult to deceive third physics, leaving it in the dark about third-party adventures. Firstly, because she is constantly on the alert. And he's talking about leaving in the dark about like cheating. So it's hard to deceive 3F about cheating. Firstly, because she is constantly on the alert, waiting and afraid of betrayal. And secondly, she has absolute hearing for the most subtle vibrations of the human body. Just as a view of the third physics on sexual life is not without hypocrisy, its perception of nudity suffers from a certain flaw. Therefore, the most consistent opponents of nudism and pornography are usually recruited from the ranks of the touchy ones. In this regard, let me make a small interesting observation about third physics. An early and very characteristic sign of it can be called the habit of turning away from the TV screen at the moment of showing love scenes, even a simple kiss. There is no reason to attribute this reaction to upbringing, since it manifests itself very early in childhood. It remains to talk about a certain innate moral feeling, a certain innate modesty. However, this explanation is valid only insofar as it concerns the obvious innateness of the reaction. In fact, the child turns away from the image of a kiss not out of natural shyness, but out of innate viciousness, because he has third physics. This means that the child is highly sensual, and his physical perception is so heightened that he not only sees a kiss on the screen, but also feels its taste on his lips. And this involuntary invasion of someone else's kiss with one's lips makes the child turn away from the screen. Yeah, I think as an analogy, I do agree with that. It does. Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of, again, like it's not only what he just said, but it's also, again, like jealousy, like physiological jealousy and envy of other people, especially on a movie screen. Like they're usually attractive people, so it's like envying their attractiveness, the jealousy of the touch, and then also the empathy the uncomfortable empathizing of it. So you can abstract that from like watching a film to other realms, to kind of get the essence of it. Another reason for the touchy's hostility to everything that relates to the intimate sphere, to nudism and pornography, I think, is the fear of the power that nudity has over him. Once in the presence of Tolstoy, displeasure was expressed about the fact that the sculptor Paolo Trubetskoy and his wife went naked to swim in the river, and Tolstoy, unable to directly condemn his friend, made a characteristic confession. I have always had this feeling of shame. For example, the sight of a woman with bare breasts was always disgusting to me, even in my youth. Then another feeling was mixed in, but everything, it was a shame. Yeah, so okay, so he's feeling not only disgust, but also he's feeling disgust with himself for getting like turned on by it. It's that feeling of um, it's the feeling of hating your own body and then seeing someone else's body, being envious of them, but also the power that the opposite sex has on your physiology, causing a reaction in you that you don't control, right? That can be uncomfortable, especially for 3Fs, right? What's disgusting about a woman's breasts? Indeed, it was not out of innate modesty that Tolstoy turned away from her, but by natural, how do you spell? I've definitely pronounced this word before. Lascivious, oh, geez, I can't believe I can't pronounce that. Well, anyway, it's like lasciviousness. Jeez, I'm brain farting on that one. Anyway, more importantly, the sight of naked breasts was too intoxicating for him, too attractive, leading to frightening self-forgetfulness. Tolstoy felt no shame, but fear of the magical power of nudity over himself, and it was this that forced him to avert his eyes. It was not for nothing that Tolstoy loved to retell a dream he allegedly saw once with a landowner he knew. He dreamed of the following. He was walking along a narrow path through the bushes, focused on two hills rising in front. Suddenly, the landowner stumbles, gets his foot into a quagmire, and begins to drown. When immersed in a quagmire up to his waist, he glanced at the two hills rising ahead. He sees the head of a giant woman rising from behind them. Horror seizes the landowner when he realizes where he is plunging, and here awakening comes. It was not for nothing that Tolstoy loved to retell this dream, most likely which he himself had seen. Tolstoy felt himself at the sight of a woman's body in the position of that anonymous landowner, and the fear of plunging headlong into a woman's womb to the point of completely losing his eye forced him to turn his gaze away from nudity. Fear is generally the dominant, although possibly hidden, feature of the eroticism of the third physics. She is afraid of beings of the opposite sex, afraid of being denied intimacy, and is looking for the most non-traumatic ways to realize her sexuality. Let us open in this regard Father Sergius. If the reader remembers, the core of the story is the attitude of the monk, Father Sergius, towards two women. One, a secular, beautiful, broken lady, tries to seduce the monk, and in order to overcome the temptation, he cuts off his finger. The other is simply a weak-minded merchant's daughter. As soon as she appears before Father Sergius, she turns out to be so seductive that he immediately breaks his vow of chastity with her. Tolstoy was asked, why did Father Sergius break down as a fool, resisting the onslaught of his socialite? Tolstoy was unable or unwilling to give a clear answer to this question. Father Sergius did not succumb to temptation the first time because he was afraid. He was afraid that the secular beautiful woman would beckon, but at the last moment refuse, push him away, who had already lowered his pants, laugh in his face, and even reproach him, reminding him of his monastic vow. Fear of sexual trauma turned out to be for Friar Sergius so great that he preferred to cut off his finger rather than undergo such a test. The story with the fool is a different matter. She, already due to her painful condition, guaranteed in advance the third physics. The third physics is triumph, I guess. I'm not sure. Sergius had complete sexual comfort, and lo and behold, the fall from sin did not slow down. The example from Father Sergius, of course, is not evidence that the third physics is only busy hunting for the mentally disabled. It is only an illustration of the thesis about the preference that the touchy gives to non-traumatic ways of realizing their sexuality. There are other ways that can be called perversions, inversions, or unconventional ways of love, as you like. United by common property, minimal trauma, This is masturbation, same-sex love, bestiality, fetishism. You can probably add something else in the same spirit to the proposed list. The main thing is that all these methods of love are psychologically comfortable and therefore especially valuable for third physics. Okay, so the third physics is, vulnerable or liable more than others to those sorts of like fetishisms that make like, like you said, like non-traumatic or more comfortable, where they can't be rejected or made to feel shameful. Okay. Since we were talking about perversions, it is necessary to add that not only third physics, but to a greater or lesser extent, all physicists are prone to them. Another thing is that for each of them, in this case, there is a significant difference in motives. If the third physics falls into the camp of sexual minorities out of fear, then the first, due to omnivorousness, the third, out of curiosity and love of diversity, the fourth, out of indifference. So the position of physics in itself at the levels of the functional hierarchy is not a guarantee of health or disorder of the sexual sphere, right? So, when we're talking about perversions and stuff, it's like the interesting thing is why someone becomes perverted, not, which position is more perverted. Okay, so the third is not more perverted. It's just, it's going to have different reasons and it might choose different perversions. Speaking about sex that is comfortable for, I wish you would just get off sex already. Sorry. But speaking about sex that is comfortable for third physics, it is impossible to ignore the simplest and most convenient type of fulfillment of sexual need, marriage. Here we go. Because there's no sex after marriage. So the touchy touch is a highly mating creature. Explaining the advantage of marriage, Tolstoy, from the sixth of the third physics and through the mouth of one of his heroes, not sure what that means, noted that marriage, in addition to the pleasure of the hearth, eliminating the irregularity of sexual life, provided the opportunity for a moral life. Of course, Tolstoy got a little carried away, declaring marriage a condition of moral life, etc. And yet, albeit with various reservations, the value of marriage for sexual life should be recognized, and it lies in the fact that it makes sexual intercourse legal, what is most needed by third physics, what surrounds its sex with maximum comfort. Okay, so buttressing sex with a feeling of legitimacy and comfort and safety. That would follow, right? There are many benefits. Firstly, the voluntary or involuntary presence of strangers during legal sexual intercourse puts strangers in a deliberately disadvantageous position and automatically closes their mouths, no matter what they happen to witness. Secondly, marriage, although it does not guarantee, still puts certain barriers to sexually transmitted diseases, and this is very important. In this regard, it is enough to recall the example of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who for one night with a prostitute paid, among other things, for 2 months of painful examination of himself for the appearance of the first signs of bad disease. So he had sex with a prostitute and then basically freaked out for 2 months, worrying about, if he was going to get an STD. Finally, marriage, again, does not guarantee, but it does put barriers to infidelity and the birth of other people's children, which is especially important for men with third physics. Everyone is jealous, even insects are jealous, let alone people. But the jealousy of men is touchy, so to speak. But the jealousy of third physics men is touchy, so to speak, more jealous than the jealousy of any other man, because they are afraid of not just the loss of power over a creature that they consider their own, they are afraid of not just receiving someone else's offspring, which is what every male is afraid of. The fear of the third physics is immeasurably increased by the threat that betrayal will confirm the carefully hidden but constantly felt diagnosis of the defectiveness of its physical origin. Therefore, it is natural that in search of additional levels of protection, the touchy one is in a hurry to get married, trying to legally cover his wounded body. Oof. Yeah, that whole everything in there is just like, man, it is, yeah, like, I don't know. It rings true to me. The love of children of the third physics is limitless and sometimes takes on excessive, ugly forms. The touchy-hearted seeing in seeing in childbirth not just a value, but an absolute value, independent of time, space, and circumstances, is not just prolific, but prolific in a thoughtless manner. Although it can be understood, fruiting is both a physiological and psychological need of the third physics. Through reproduction, its processional and dialogic nature is realized, but most importantly, it is a certification of the usefulness of what seems not quite full, defective from birth. So, in other words, like just as in like cuckoldry disturbs the third physics particularly because it's like having turning out that you raised a child that wasn't yours. It's like it's basically a condemnation of your genes. It's basically getting to like the very root of your physical nature and saying like you are defective, like you are not wanted, like your physical essence will not be reproduced. It's like damning you at a very basic level. So to have children, it's like a what would you call it? A not reprisal, but it's like a I'm brain farting on the word, but it's like I don't know, but it's basically a you are, oh man, I'm just brain farting on this word so bad, but yeah, it's basically giving your physical nature credit, and yeah, it's like a fruition of a fear that you had that you were defective, but because you're rearing children and rearing children well, it's like healing that wound psychologically. The underside of such a generally welcomed phenomenon as the love of children of the third physics must also include the excessively close guardianship that she usually establishes over her children. Feeling like a vulnerable creature and poorly adapted to everyday life, the touchy-feely does not always thoroughly transfer this feeling to its offspring and tries to create greenhouse conditions for its existence that are not very useful for independent life. In a word, if it so desires, the third physics produces numerous offspring, but poorly adapted to the harsh conditions of life. Another twist in the theme of love of children is the problem of choice. Life almost always presents a person with a choice, who to give preference to or who to put at the head of priorities. So third physics, no matter how the relationship develops, always puts children first. The birth of a child, even from an unloved person, gives rise to a short-term but very strong feeling in the soul of the touchable, which slowly and consistently shifts towards the primary source, the child. If the third physics, burdened with offspring, has an affair, then for some time she finds herself in the position of being crucified between the object of passion and the offspring, but in the end the matter is certainly resolved in favor of the offspring. If the object of passion and offspring can somehow be connected, then a shift in priorities still occurs. And the beloved or beloved, I don't know why I repeated that. And the beloved is gradually assigned to the place of servants of the offspring and assessed by the ability to respond to this place. I don't want to scare anyone, but if you start an affair with third physics, know that she will never love you as much as she loves her child, i.e. herself. And yeah, I can see that. So. Touchy is a very unimportant fighter, worse than anyone. The fact is that, frankly speaking, he is a coward. How much the cowardness of the third physics is noticeable to outsiders depends on many conditions, but the fact that she, less than anyone else, wants to subject her already wounded body from birth to a force test is for sure. Out of fear, third physics is too cruel in battle, if it cannot be avoided. The fear of getting injured suppresses her pity and sense of proportion. Therefore, when it comes to a fight, exceeding the necessary self-defense is a common phenomenon for the third physics. And yeah, that is something, being a, touchy coward myself, just generally trying to avoid fights and not, not really liking getting physical with people. Although I guess I do, I have an interest in martial arts to some extent, but, and war, like more abstractly, but yeah, I kind of have been, like, I guess, somewhat cowardly, just avoidant of physical confrontation, and trying to diffuse it. And yeah, but that is something I've worried about. Like, if I get into a fight, and if I get the upper hand, just kind of like losing myself and over escalating, kind of out of that like fear and like anger of being forced to fight. Yeah, just like people who fight regularly, like people who have always gotten into like scuffles and stuff. There's almost kind of like an honor among fighters, where it's like when to like stop escalating, but yeah, out of like kind of like ignorance and out of fear, it's kind of like the rat being cornered. It suddenly goes into like berserk mode. So yeah, I can see all that. However, the touchy one rarely has to fight. For him, assault, both in everyday life and in politics, is not an acceptable and most unpromising way to solve problems. If, as was said, the first physics is a born hawk, then the third physics is a born dove. Pacifism is in her blood. Therefore, it is pointless to look for the founder of pacifism. It is clear that neither Tolstoy nor Gandhi, nor even Christ, were the founders of pacifism. Their unanimity on the issue of violence is the unanimity of a certain class of people united by the third physics. The touchy one is most afraid of physical force, and therefore is at least inclined to resort to it himself. So so one thing that's interesting there is, I guess he must type Jesus Christ as a VEFL in that case, because before, in the beginning, he said that Christ had a polarity between the spirit and the flesh, and he defined a polarity by one of these functions being on the top and one being on the bottom and the other pole being on the bottom and them not touching. So in other words, it would have to be the first and the fourth is a polarity, and the first and the third is a polarity, and the second and the fourth is a polarity, but not the second and third, because while one is on top and the other is on the bottom, they're touching, right? And so he said that Christ had a polarity between V and F, and I had wrongly thought that he was typing Christ as a VELF, but in this case, I guess he must type him as a. He could maybe type him as a. I doubt that he types Christ as a VLFE. I don't think he does. Probably VEFL in that case, which would be the same type as Tolstoy. Okay. So I'll say right away, God forbid anyone assume that the pacifism of the third physics, both in everyday life and in politics, is the norm, a model for resolving controversial issues. In no case. Precisely dose violence is an argument no worse than others, especially in relation to people who themselves do not disdain assault. So, in other words, like, he's kind of making he's making a comment, kind of like his own personal view that pacifism is not good. Instead, like, you should be ready to defend yourself, because there's people out there who have no, qualms about assaulting you. And I agree with that, but it is kind of just, that's his opinion, although it's a good one. But pacifism is a social expression of personal cowardice. Therefore, no matter how high words and authoritative quotes cowardice and pacifism surround themselves with, they are a flaw, not an adornment of the third physics, especially of men. In this regard, I will allow myself one piece of good advice to parents of boys with third physics. Send them to the Kyokushinkai Mas Oyama style of karate school. I myself have devoted several years to this most aggressive, combative style of karate, and I know firsthand how beneficial its influence is on the state of third physics. So I guess Afanasiev, he types himself as third physics. Now, I had heard he typed himself from somebody as LVFE, which would be my type. I don't know if that's true, but that is interesting. That so he's kind of saying like, and that's why his complaint against pacifism is kind of like, brought back from just like a flippant opinion to something. He's saying like, hey, like I'm third physics, and being honest with myself, like that natural pacifism, that's really like a neurotic flaw. It's not actually right. That's something that was flawed in me due to third physics. And then here's how you combat that. So, okay. After all, what is truly painful for third physics is not the pain itself, but the exaggerated idea of pain. Therefore, when having taken up karate, the touchy one in the process of sports fights is convinced that his body is not as flimsy as it seemed, and is capable of taking a blow. That his own fist also weighs something, reality and the idea of pain will become adequate to each other. And the adequacy of real and perceived pain is the fighting norm that immediately rids third physics of the two most intolerant vices in society, which there's a colon, and I wish that translation continued, because I would be interested in what he thinks the most intolerant vices in society are. But yeah, that's pretty good. And for myself, I agree with that. I mean, I've done some kind of like light martial arts stuff before, and yeah, that is definitely like kind of a neurotic issue with me, is kind of being, I don't know, like physically like cowardly in a way, and being afraid of bodily harm. What if I'm doing martial arts or fighting and I get a concussion, and now my 1L is affected, right? That would be the worst. And yeah, but saying that, I think he's right that really, I mean, what I do need to do martial arts. Like reading this again, I read it the other day, but reading this again, it is kind of cementing in me that like, yeah, like I really do need to like take up martial arts or to do something more adventurous. Going to the gym is good, but the gym is a very controlled environment. And yeah, I think something like martial arts, a little bit of the unexpected, and that would be good for me. And it would kind of help me get over a lot of things. So yeah. In sports, the third physics is cautious and at the same time gambling, filled with outward contempt and secret envy. In a word, it displays the double dealing usual for the third functions. Tolstoy, a consistent opponent of any physicality, enthusiastically engaged in physical education, and having left the village, he frightened the peasants by hanging upside down on the horizontal bar for a long time, for which he was awarded by them the nickname Strange Gentleman. Okay. In light of what has said about... Oh, I gotta sip my tea before it goes completely cold. Okay. In light of what has been said about third physics, it is not difficult to guess that it is unusually law-abiding. Her natural compassion, lack of silver, aversion to violence, and fear of retaliatory violence, which practically guarantees an insignificant percentage of touchables in general criminal statistics. The only crime that a touchy person relatively often decides to commit, due, by the way, to the same third physics, is a crime of jealousy. That the third physics is the only one of the physics suffering from physiological jealousy has already been said before. What kind of torment the jealous touchy pants feels, and what he feels when taking revenge for his real or imaginary insult to honor, is conveyed with incredible power and accuracy in Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata. Read it. Without dwelling further on the details of the crimogenesis of the third physics, I will note a detail that is also very accurately captured in the Kreutzer Sonata, and is also related to the chronicle of incidents. The fact is that the touchy person quite often has thoughts of suicide. This thought can even become obsessive and manic, but only in exceptional cases is it put into practice. Let us remember that Tolstoy's hero, having killed his wife out of jealousy, decides to commit suicide, and then this is what happens to him. Yes, now I have to do it myself, I said to myself. But I said this and knew that I would not kill myself. However, I stood up and took the revolver in my hands. But a strange thing, I remember how many times before I was close to suicide. Now I could not only kill myself, but even now I could not only not kill myself, but I couldn't even think about it. Tolstoy does not say why the hero often had thoughts of suicide and why, even after killing his wife, he did not commit suicide. And the answer to these two questions is quite simple. The desire to commit suicide, which periodically arises in the touchy, is associated with a subconscious desire to turn off the most restless, inconvenient, constantly nagging function, physics. But the powerful physiological imagination inherent in the third physics, which is able to reproduce in advance all the sensations of leaving life, does not allow this thirst to be quenched. As soon as she imagines how a bullet, having crushed the skull, drills a tunnel in the tissues of the brain, or how the lungs slowly gurgle and fill with dirty river water, or how the insides burned by the poison shudder, the suicidal obsession disappears by itself. The sensory of the third physics is extremely refined, hearing overtones that the ordinary ear cannot hear, feeling the most microscopic changes in the environment with her skin, smelling odors that are not detected by the nose of the average person, seeing tonal transitions that the ordinary eye cannot see is not much difficulty for her. For me, I will say that my senses are not that good. In fact, I have a lot of vision issues, and I have like partial color blindness, so I have troubles. My ability to see green is reduced by maybe 15% or something. So I often don't distinguish like blue and purple very well. So yeah, for me, that's not very true. I do not have keen senses. That's why the touchy ones make great massage therapists, tuners, and tasters. As a wonderful illustration of the theme of tasting the third physics, I will remind you of the story of the Prophet Muhammad. One day, a certain widow of a tribal leader killed by order of the Prophet sent Muhammad a roasted ram rubbed with poison. A feast was held in the tent, but the Prophet, taking a small piece into his mouth, immediately felt something was wrong and spat out the piece, thereby saving his life, although not without painful consequences. If the initial refinement of the third physics is accompanied by intense training and physical trauma, illness, beatings, deprivation, then the perception of the touchy can reach an inhuman, mystical, magical level. Thus, from the third physics, severe illnesses and grueling musical exercises, the genius of Paganini emerged, whose subtlety of hearing became a legend. Gifted with the finest hearing, Paganini had incredible sensitivity in this sense. The left ear, accustomed to the violin's proximity, heard much more acutely than the right, and the eardrum became so tender that he experienced great pain if someone spoke loudly at his side or near him. At the same time, he was able to detect the quietest sounds at a great distance. Of course, the possibility of refined perception does not equate to a love for everything refined, but in the case of third physics, both coincide. Her taste is characterized by a predilection for subtle, elegant objects, for dim, complex colors, for a subtle, rich, aromatic range, for a complex, quiet scale. Yeah, and I do see that in third physics types as well as myself. Although my senses are not very keen, but I do relate to the rest of this. The activities of touch-me-nots in production also have some specific features. For example, a conveyor belt is completely contradicted for him. The monotony inherent in the conveyor belt, the ban on amateur performance, and the doom of monologue traumatize the sophisticated organization of the third physics and quickly put it out of action. The touchy one is wary of working mechanisms, so the process of mastering them with third physics can be difficult and somewhat drawn out. That is one of my when I describe third physics to somebody, one of the fears is like operating heavy machinery, and generally dealing with tools, especially dangerous tools. That is an issue for 3F. In production, as in sex, she has long preferred the role of a follower to the role of a leader. However, by the end of the training, the shyness of the touchy pants usually disappears, and a long process of creative, artistic, refined processing of the experience gained begins, sometimes bringing even the simplest operations to a state close to real art. Yeah, I can definitely see that in third physics types. In this regard, I recall the story of a Chinese meat cutter who was very proud of the fact that for several decades he used the same knife when cutting. And the secret of the longevity of the knife was that this Chinese man, over time, brought his more than simple occupation to such a degree of virtuosity that possessing almost X-ray vision, he saw any even microscopic voids in the meat and moved the knife along them with impeccable accuracy, cutting carcasses with virtually no effort and tool depreciation. Since we are talking about China and the third physics, it remains to add that, according to my assumptions, it was the third physics that was the creator of such a unique phenomenon as Chinese cuisine. It is interesting because it is the complete opposite of the simple, clear, natural, poor Japanese cuisine created by the second physics. And I think he means poor, poor as in like simple, and also poor as in like undeveloped, maybe. Not taken to a sophisticated extent. And from what I understand about Japanese cuisine, that is true. Chinese cuisine, on the other hand, is vast, complex, bejeweled, refined, paradoxical. There are simply no colors to accurately describe it. So I will limit myself to the statement: if the reader wants to know to what artistry the activity of the third physics in the material sphere can rise, illustrations are better than Chinese cuisine, hard to find. Okay, so Chinese cuisine is a good illustration of 3F physics. The attitude towards the food problem of the third physics is best expressed in the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I love to eat, but I'm not greedy. Greedy for everything tasty, but not a gourmet. Too many other tendencies distract me from this. I only pay attention to my stomach when my heart is free. Among other things, what is remarkable in Rousseau's recognition is the construction of a hierarchy from the heart, first emotion, and the stomach, third physics, where the heart clearly prevails over the stomach. Based on this phrase alone, one can begin to build the order of functions in Rousseau as a whole. And in fact, he types Rousseau, I think, as ELFV. So the economic relations of the third physics in everyday life and society are ambiguous and distorted. On the one hand, her vulnerability requires boundless stinginess to cover the sore spot as effectively as possible. On the other hand, pity, imaginary asceticism, super processivity of the third function provokes a policy of sweeping gestures, impulses of generosity, and thoughtless spending. As a result, the economic face of the touchy pants turns out to be strangely split, resulting in what academician Sakharov self-critically called slightly miserly. Moreover, the misery of the third physics usually takes petty, eccentric forms, what we usually call saving on matches. And at the same time, third physics loves to give expensive gifts, considers it his sacred duty to participate in charitable activities. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can see that for myself, like being very, like, weirdly stingy on the one hand, and like getting like way too nitty gritty, like, comparing, two two products at Walmart where the difference is like, $1 between them, and it's like, but just sitting there for like 20 minutes, like, going over it. But at the same time, just like giving, paying for friends' meals willy nilly and just being kind of like generous with my, physical money and just wealth or whatever. Um, yeah, it's kind of a weird contradiction. And I see that in other 3F types as well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau conveyed very accurately the specific two-faced attitude of the third physics to money. He wrote, "One of my imaginary contradictions, a combination of almost stinginess with the greatest contempt for money. I understand so well that money was not created for me that I am almost ashamed to have it, much less use it. If I ever had a certain insufficient income for life, I would not be in danger of becoming a miser. I am firmly convinced of this. I would spend all my income without trying to increase it, but insecurity keeps me at bay." The touchy-feely has an extremely heightened sense of ownership. He rarely has many things, but what little third physics does have has a special status and meaning. Only in his home among his things does the touchable feel not only comfortable but at ease. No matter how cozy someone else's house is, and how convenient other people's things are, they are, not to say bad, but inconvenient for the third physics simply because they are strangers. In terms of preferences in socioeconomic policy, third physics is closest to the title of communist. You can call her differently, monk, kibbuznik. The essence will not change. And the point is that the touchy one is internally closest to the equalization and distribution system. Okay. Now that's interesting, and in a future video I would like to say more about that, because I think that third physics types can be, it's, again, take what he's saying as an analogy, and I think when you take these single positions and then you combine them into types, you get a more like nuanced view. And it's interesting how there can be like kind of like layers of like communisticness and like I have ideas about this, but I'm too tired and I don't want to. This is already a long enough section, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So the nature of the communist sympathies of the third physics is quite transparent. She feels like the weakest and most vulnerable link in society. Therefore, in order not to put their life and health at risk, the touchy one tries to place the burden of personal problems on the backs of those around them, insisting on an equalizing and distributive system of the economy that promises, regardless of contribution, equal protection for everyone. The fact that such a system is ineffective does not bother third physics much. It does not strive for wealth in principle and is ready to come to terms with the minimum as long as it is guaranteed. I don't really agree with that, to be honest. I don't know, maybe it's just my type in particular, LVFE, but I think a lot of us are not like that. There's more nuance that's added with the other functions and their positions. I do agree with kind of the tending to like, place a burden of personal problems on the backs of those around them. That's like a negative side of 3F, like more in the so-called like dormant state. This tendency to just want to avoid dealing with physics and wanting other people to do it, but then also not really being satisfied with the way they do it, and feeling like a sort of like guilt stacking up, and then that kind of breaks into reactivity. But anyway, I'm super tired now. I got to get through these next two paragraphs. Vladimir Bukovsky, looking at the communist aspirations of some Western intellectuals from the heights of his healthy second physics, caustically and accurately remarked, "Where do socialists get so much commercialism? After all, most of them are intellectuals living in a world of ideas, not things. Their theory is surprisingly inconsistent. On the one hand, they are always criticizing consumerism, materialism, and self-interest, and on the other hand, it is this aspect of life that worries them most. It is in consumerism that they want to establish equality. Do they really believe that if everyone is given an equal ration of bread, everyone will become brothers? Can people really become brothers who jealously count each other's income and enviously follow with their eyes every piece swallowed by their neighbor? Bukowski's observation is not news, it is an involuntary plagiarism of what Dostoevsky said much earlier. And of course, the translation cuts off. I really wonder how much of this book is missing from this link I have. Like the skepticism of the third logic, the communism of the third physics is not a philosophy, but a flawed psychology. A psychology of a small but influential population group. Therefore, observing now the death of communism in its state forms, one should not conclude that with it the communist idea itself will disappear into oblivion. It will continue to exist only within the boundaries naturally assigned to it, without a claim to dominance, in the form of small parties, communities, communes, monasteries, kibbutzim. It will live as long as the third physics is alive. Again, like I really would push back against that. It's deeper than communism. Communism is like a readily available label for kind of what 3F is doing, but a better way to put it is like it's a sort of I'm too tired to go into it now, to be honest, and I should save it for a separate video, but yeah, interesting stuff there. So that was 3F, and good night.